Highlights. Yeah, this is 48. Agent Smith time, ladies and gentlemen, ladies and zombies, ladies and gentlemen, patrons of the Rollerblade store. Welcome, 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 one and all. We are about to begin with episode 48 of World Discussion with Agent Smith. This segment started something like 2 years ago now. Almost every Sunday, not quite every one. We're on like a 4-week streak now. Without further ado, let's hop in. We don't have a question person right now, but if someone shows up, it's fine. If not, we can talk for a long time. It's whatever. Here we go. And now we introduce to you Agent Smith.
Hello.
What's up, dude?
Oh, hey. Not much. How are you?
Not bad. I mean, I died to zombies a couple times and fell off a building, but aside from that, I'm okay.
Okay, that sounds painful.
Yeah, well, it was just in a video game, so I'm not that hurt.
Well, I should hope so.
Just like existentially hurt.
Just existentially hurt.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there are worse ways to be hurt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been a super hard working stream week. I think I did something like, let me check the hours. I did 70 hours.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I respect your work ethic.
Yeah, there was a quote that I heard recently from a like inspirational YouTube video. Let me get it. It was something about passion. Oh yeah. Passion is not a luxury, it's a requirement on the road to greatness. And that was kind of like, that was like, damn.
Yeah, that certainly greases the wheels.
Yeah, well,
I could have used some of that this morning when I was trying to get out of bed.
People need grease in different places in their vehicle or whatever.
Well, what strikes your fancy this week?
Well, with the 70-hour shindig, I haven't really done anything else. It's kind of been awake, stream, sleep, with some workouts here and there.
Gotcha.
Catch us up. What happened?
Nothing I found particularly exciting. Mostly just stuff that was already going on with some new developments. So, not really all that dramatic in the grand scheme of things. I guess Venezuela is one of the things I wanted to hit on, because that's continued to evolve as a story. You know, I talked a bit about it last week and how I was still trying to figure out kind of what the game plan was for the opposition, just what they were kind of trying to do. And we're kind of getting a better idea as time goes on. So it may be that this bare minimum at least, you could say that they're trying to force the Maduro government into a catch-22, where they can either accept the foreign aid that the opposition is trying to bring into the country, in which case it could be used to undermine the government's authority, because like we talked about last week, one of the sources of authority for the government is the distribution of rations, rationed food and supplies and whatnot. But on the other hand, if they reject the foreign aid, they don't have to worry about that, but they do take a PR hit. It doesn't really look good to be rejecting aid, especially when there's a lot of needy people around. So that could be the plan. That might well have been the plan from the start, because I remember reading over the past week about opposition protests at some of the border crossings where they were trying to bring aid over. So that may have been to try to get into the media, for optics. They might also be trying to split off some lower-ranking soldiers. There had been talk about, specifically from the Trump administration, Trump himself said that the U.S. government knew where the military's money was being hidden, because there's lots of accusations about high-ranking officers in the military being politically connected and getting lots of money from their positions, through corruption. And so the U.S. government made that implicit threat that it knew where that money was being laundered and hidden. and that it would kind of behoove those generals to defect and turn on the Maduro government. And that's probably not going to happen because a lot of those generals do depend on the government kind of for their income, and they probably don't particularly trust the opposition to kind of look the other way if the Maduro government was overthrown. That's just the nature of political patronage. Once you're in so deep, it can be hard to get out, even if you want to. And they are pretty thoroughly entrenched. The Maduro government went out of its way to appoint lots of generals to positions in government that are not traditionally military positions, things like state-owned companies and other related positions. And those, of course, offer lots of opportunities for corruption and self-enrichment and whatnot. So that's kind of the quid pro quo. In exchange for giving those positions to military personnel, it's kind of expected by the Maduro government that they will be loyal in return. And the gains that they get from those positions are probably high enough to ensure that going forward. So it's unlikely the higher levels of the military will defect. That's my argument anyway. But the lower levels might be more likely to defect, depending on circumstances. So that might be what the opposition is trying to focus on with this foreign aid strategy. They may be trying to put low-ranking soldiers in a position where they're having to stop foreign aid. So that's a very different context than controlling violent protests or a possible rebellion. It's a very different context, and it's a little harder to maintain the front that you're purely you're purely on the defensive when you're actively stopping what is in effect just free food and supplies. So that's bad optics for the government, and it makes it a little more likely that maybe some low-ranking soldiers will defect. I think there was a couple that defected over the past week, but not a whole lot thus far.
It kind of fits with that general trend of a lot of times you'll change jobs for a chance at promotion. So this is kind of like a change factions for a chance at ranking up.
That could be. But I was thinking more, not so much the officers, but more like non-commissioned officers and enlisted personnel. The actual infantry on the ground. So I don't think if you're enlisted, you're not as concerned generally about promotions and whatnot, unless you're kind of trying to go career and you want to be a non-com. Somebody from the military can correct me on that if I've got that wrong, but that's my understanding. So low-level defections like that are less predicated on expected reward or some path forward through the ranks, but rather some path forward via promotion, but generally more through ideology or political preference or what have you. That's kind of how it happened in Syria. The Syrian civil war kind of started with a number of defections from the army, and a lot of those people just didn't want to do the things that the government was asking them to do to the protesters. So it could be that the Venezuelan opposition is trying to kind of replicate that to a degree by putting soldiers in a position where they have to do something they don't want to do, which is to stop foreign aid. There's also another element to that. It may also be that they're trying to force them to confront migrant protesters, because beyond just opposition protesters, people who don't like the government anyway, there's also people who just want to migrate out of the country but who can't because the borders are closed. And obviously they can find other ways out, but some people just kind of get caught in the middle, and so then they kind of get stuck, and so they've also been protesting as well. So all told, if they get enough defections, hypothetically, they could build an alternative security apparatus for the National Assembly government under Guaido. But again, they haven't gotten very many defections thus far, so that's maybe at most a long-term plan, and it may not even be that. It may be that they're not even really trying to get a lot of defections at all. That's just speculation on my part. It may be that they're just trying to apply general political pressure on the Maduro government to try to increase discontent and dissent against the government. Even if there were defections, it probably wouldn't matter that much, because the government could always just deploy Chavista militia to the borders instead of regular troops. They've already done that on the border with Brazil, I think, is what I read. And, Chavista militiamen are a lot less likely to defect, obviously, than just regulars in the army. given their political preferences. So I don't think it's really a great strategy if they're doing it to get defections, because again, the government can deflect that pretty easily. But again, unclear at this point just what the purpose is. These are just some ideas I'm kind of sharing. Some speculation on my part based on what we've seen over the past week. They might also be trying to create problems by just forcing the government to basically shut down the border. That in itself creates some economic problems. And then the Maduro government, for its part, has been sending kind of mixed signals on this. So it's not really clear just what their strategy is going to be going forward. Nominally, thus far, it's just been trying to block the foreign aid, but invariably it's going to get in eventually. They don't have to bring it in over the highway there, which is where most of the border checks are that are being blocked. So eventually it's going to get in one way or the other. So for now, they're just trying to block highways to physically stop it. And Maduro actually came out a week or two ago and said that the aid was poisoned and that it was, I think, meant to cause cancer or something like that. It was warning people not to consume it for that reason. It was justifying the blockade for that reason.
Guys, this aid gives you heartburn. Don't. Just don't.
But there was also an aide of Maduro who kind of walked that back over the past week, and he was saying the government would allow to accept the aid, quote unquote, at their own risk. So kind of taking a more moderate line on that. That could be the start of a opening there, allowing the aid in, but it's unclear at this point. So all told, it's still pretty fuzzy in terms of what's going on. It's pretty clear that the U.S. is involved to some degree. They probably do have some kind of arrangement to help or otherwise assist the nominal Guaido government that was elected by the National Assembly. But it's not really clear, again, just what their game plan is and what their end game is, just what they're trying to do here. It might be that at most it's just trying to score political points, just to try to make the Maduro government look bad and to try to get key actors in the government to turn on him. But beyond that, I don't know what else they might want to do, and I don't really know what else they could do. Because, if they escalate too much, there could be a conflict, like a civil war or violent confrontation, and the opposition is not well disposed to wage such a conflict. I don't think they would fare very well. And a direct intervention by the United States, like I was saying last week, would be very unpopular in the United States and Venezuela and the rest of Latin America. So I think that's a non-starter. I don't think that they're really going to go that direction. Maybe at most some special ops type stuff, but I think even that would be risky on the part of the government. But I could be wrong. Again, I'm not an insider, so I don't really know what they're doing. And there are some very hawkish people in the Trump administration who may be very risk tolerant in terms of the kind of policies they're trying to get the president to implement. So a long-winded way of saying I still don't really know what they're doing, but those are some ideas. They do seem to be trending towards a kind of confrontation, at least politically, with the Maduro government, but it's not clear yet how far they're willing to take that. So there was that.
It seems like that's one of the main dramas over the past several sessions we've had is Venezuela. Mm-hmm. So what's Venezuela doing this week? We had a few where it was all about North Korea posturing. It seems like they've been a little bit more quiet recently, relative to a lot of last year.
They've been kind of riding the quote-unquote Trump negotiations. They got a little headwind from that, and so they've kind of been trying to get as much time and negotiating leverage out of that as they can. There's kind of two tracks of negotiations that are ongoing. One is the Trump-Kim negotiation, specifically over the North Korean nuclear weapons. That's been very quiet since that summit in, I think it was Singapore last year, I think it was. And since then, there hasn't been a whole lot going on there. There have been a few U.S. government officials who have gone over and talked some more, but in general, there's kind of not stagnation, but there's kind of an impasse over whether sanctions should be at least partially relieved before there's denuclearization, or if North Korea should implement some denuclearization steps before any sanctions relief happens. So that's kind of where they're stuck right now. Obviously, Kim Jong-un would like for the sanctions relief to happen first as a sign of good faith. But then the United States argues that no, we have the leverage, you should denuclearize first, especially since it was illegal for you to get nukes in the first place. So you do that, then we'll talk about sanctions relief. So that's just kind of gone back and forth, and I kind of suspect the North Korean government is probably dragging it out on purpose, because I think they're really focused a lot more on the negotiations with South Korea, which is not something we've seen as much in the US, I think. I guess, to be fair, I don't watch a lot of CNN anymore, so I don't really know. But in general, South Korea's government is a sort of center-left government, if I'm remembering correctly. Again, somebody in chat, can correct me on that if I'm wrong. But the South Korean government's under this new president, or relatively new president, their approach to North Korea has kind of been a continuation of a previous policy that was kind of known as the Sunshine Policy, and which was basically a policy of engagement, where they just try to engage with the North Korean government on economic issues and security issues in particular, and try to use those as carrots, so to speak, as incentives to get the North Korean government to give concessions on their end on those issues. And there's been lots of symbolic actions taken on the part of the South and North Korean governments over the past couple months. They had a photo op where the two leaders were on this mountain that's important in in Korean culture and its history. And they've taken some nominal steps towards reunification. Mostly it's just promises, which are probably going to be empty, but it is progress to at least have promises that there's going to be a move in that direction and that they're going to at least talk about it more. So, people in Korea are kind of excited because it's more progress on that front than has been seen in a very long time. But at the same time, nothing really concrete has happened yet, like nothing too substantive. So all of this could very easily just be a front that doesn't actually go anywhere. And certainly previous rounds of negotiations like this with North Korea have kind of ended similarly. So that wouldn't be all that surprising. So it's just kind of up in the air right now. I think they are negotiating another summit meeting, which I think is going to happen in, it looks like, Hanoi in Vietnam. But it's not really clear what they'll negotiate, what the status of the negotiations is, and etc. So we'll see. That's something to watch. But that's kind of why you haven't seen much of it in the news. It's just kind of been on the back burner in the US, and most of the traction in the negotiation has been more inter-Korean, between North and South Korea. And that stuff doesn't get as much attention over here.
So that's cool. More of the usual kind of posturing. Nothing like super major substance being pushed through.
Yeah, that's kind of what it looks like from my end. And, again, I'm not a big insider, so I don't really know for sure. This is just my perspective. It might be a good time for the usual disclaimer for those who are new to this segment. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have a stronger background in some subjects than others. So if I say anything that's wrong, biased, or stupid, or what have you, please do contribute in chat and point it out. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is definitely encouraged in that regard. It's meant to be more kind of a conversation. So please do so. Oh, and I won't read the chat while we do this. I try to focus on the questions, but I will read it later. So, I will see what you post eventually.
We may have a couple new Agent Smith people. I'm thinking we could do some sort of training because we have Strophium, who just showed up, and Ragnarokhet and Sven may step up and do some Q&A. So you may have questions posted from different people in your text chat, but yeah, that's going to give us more versatility for when Sunday rolls around. I know the scheduling of Agent Smith is sometimes very last minute. Are we doing it now? Sure, okay.
It suits the schedules involved.
It's just how we do things. People have to live with it. Is it worth it? Well, You don't really have a choice, so.
Let's see. What else was going on? There's been some progress in the US-China trade talks, but none of that has really been released yet. So it's unclear just what's happening with that, but there was some word about a currency deal that was agreed. Nothing on that has been officially released, but nominally that was supposedly happened. China, for its part, has expressed, over the course of the negotiations, not necessarily recently, but has expressed a willingness to buy more soybeans and buy more semiconductors from the U.S. It's not entirely clear how they would do that. I would assume that they would do that through state-owned enterprises, which consume those goods as inputs to, something else that they're working on. So presumably, part of the eventual deal will probably include some proportional increase in the amount of those goods that are consumed by Chinese state-owned enterprises, which kind of ties back into a previous conversation we've had about, just what a possible trade agreement would look like with China, one that kind of rectifies all of the points of disagreement between the US and China. And I kind of speculated before that, one possibility would be structural change in China's politics and economy, which would be necessary to kind of fully satisfy all of the demands by the US, but that's pretty unlikely given that the Communist Party of China is not interested in taking such steps, because they would weaken their hold on power. They would make it introduce new risk into China's politics and society that the party wants to mitigate and is not comfortable with. So more likely is an alternative, which is where China makes some superficial reforms and nominally agrees to increase imports from the US by, a certain amount. Basically buying, the right to the status quo, so to speak. So that could be what the soybean and semiconductor, well, that could involve soybeans and semiconductors, rather.
Such a funny combo to have those together, but yeah.
Well, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, U.S. agriculture rather is a major world producer of soybeans, so that would certainly help out a lot of U.S. farmers. And then semiconductors is an area that China is still kind of dependent on imports for. They've developed a lot of technology, but they're still working on semiconductors. So importing more U.S. semiconductors in particular is pretty feasible. Right now I think it's a little more diversified in terms of where they source them from, but nominally, in so much as state-owned enterprises are involved in that trade, they could easily increase imports if they wanted to. Maybe they don't actually have to use them for anything. I think Japan was kind of strong-armed into importing more semiconductors in the 80s during the trade conflict back then, and I think they ended up just dumping most of them in Tokyo Bay. Didn't really need them. It was just more, again, about purchasing the status quo and just having a price. The U.S. basically giving them a price tag for continuing the trade relationship as was, and then them paying the price for it. So let's see. But there's still a lot of disagreements. Yeah, that's kind of where it is right now. Both parties from both sides, representatives from both parties have kind of come out and said that there's still a lot of disagreements. And if no agreement is made, then the Trump administration has threatened to hike tariffs to 25% against imports from China into the U.S. And I think they've already been hiked to something like 10%. I think that was kind of earlier last year when they kind of started the trade conflict / trade war, however you want to frame that. So 25% would be a pretty significant increase.
We used to have a strong economy, but then we got tariffed. Oh no.
Well, that's kind of another debate, the degree to which the tariffs are really kind of impacting not only the Chinese economy, but the U.S. economy. It's a little unclear thus far. Certainly pushing China out of global supply chains, which is, well, at least U.S. supply chains, is going to be disruptive to the bottom line for a lot of large corporations in the U.S. But nominally, they can kind of shift their sourcing around to kind of get around that. So it's not too big a deal for the U.S. economy. But then it's also debatably not really that big a deal for the Chinese economy, because exports don't make up nearly as big a percentage of their economy as they kind of used to. The Communist Party of China has really been going out of their way over the past I want to say, what, 10, 15 years to kind of increase domestic consumption as the key part of China's economy, to try to get away from a dependence on exports, specifically so that other countries would not have as much leverage over them in so much as they were dependent on exports. So that shift has kind of been happening. It hasn't really been coming along as much as they would like. It was supposed to also correspond with a move up value chains to produce higher value goods that employed more high-skilled people and produced more high-skilled jobs. The Chinese economy has kind of been a mixed bag on that count. It's still kind of hovering sort of in low middle income range as far as GDP per capita. So the party isn't really comfortable with that, but they have been successful in diversifying away from exports to a degree. And so that means that the tariffs that the US is implementing are not as impactful as they would have been, say, 10 years ago or so. So they'll probably be able to kind of hedge that. And if tariffs do increase to 25%, it may be that the Communist Party of China just kind of accepts that as the cost of maintaining their development model, which they see as being the only really viable one for them. It's not necessarily that they don't think China could develop on part of the West in a sort of actual free market, free trade environment, but the thing is, in the Communist Party of China, the political culture is very risk averse. So they're not really comfortable just kind of leaving it to chance. The political culture there very much emphasizes central planning and risk aversion. And so they want state-owned enterprises to be part of the development model. They want to push Chinese manufacturing. They want to push Chinese technological development. They want to do all that stuff, which kind of, to a degree, requires an industrial policy, or at least involves an industrial policy. And that's a big sticking point in the negotiations just in and of itself. How can you have, on the one hand, one party involved, that being the United States, that really emphasizes free market competition and rule of law and the corresponding institutions thereof? How can you have that party trade with a counterparty like China, where rule of law is very weak, where it's more rule of man, where the institutions of law are relatively weak and subject to the whims of the party, where free market competition is not really as much as it could be. It's really much more, I guess, what you used to call crony capitalism. And there's a lot of state actors in the economy that receive a lot of support and an unfair advantage in competition. So those are two very different models, and it's very difficult to reconcile them. That's part of why the U.S. government's position in the trade negotiations is that there be structural changes in China. But of course, again, that threatens the party's whole, its grip on power, but again, it's also its whole perspective on how to develop China's economy. So it may be that 25% tariffs are the price the party considers worth paying in order to kind of stay the course, what they believe to be the only really viable one, given their circumstances. So we did have some questions rolling in. I guess since it's still early, I might ask, I don't know if we have any Ukrainians listening, but I did want to ask them, and they can kind of answer in chat if they are so inclined. I was reading that the guy leading the presidential polls lately is a actor named, I think his name is Volodymyr Zelensky, and I don't know a lot about him. I think what I read was that he was famous for playing the president on a TV show. And now he's actually running for president, and apparently he's leading the polls. So I was going to ask anybody from Ukraine who might be listening if they could kind of mention how much support does he really have? Does it actually look like he could win the presidency?
I could see him as a president.
Well, apparently a lot of people do, but he kind of came out of nowhere. I think a couple months ago, the last poll I read was that Tymoshenko was in the league, Yulia Tymoshenko, the former gas oligarch. So I'm kind of curious where this new guy came from and how Ukrainians perceive him. Let's see. So let's take a look at... So the first question we had here was, any perspective at all on the slow decline / collapse of the Australian economy / housing market? Any impact on other Asian or international markets? We were not really heavily affected by the 08 collapse. Will this potential 19 recession be isolated to Australia? I hadn't really heard anything about Australia's economy being in terminal decline. As far as I knew, they were still doing okay. I know that things have been slowing down. You know, the global demand for, I mean, Australia, for those who aren't familiar with the Australian economy, or at least its recent history, it's been in a very long economic expansion. And I want to say it started in like the 90s or so. But, starting several decades ago, there was a big boom in mineral production, things like iron and other raw resources like that. Basically mining. And I'm sure there was probably some other things, but I think mining was the main thing. And mining really took off, and that's kind of carried the Australian economy for a long time now. And that was one of the reasons that Australia's economy basically kind of floated through the 2008 financial crisis without too much of a problem. I think there was a dip, but they kind of weathered it. And a lot of that growth has kind of come from demand from China and other developing economies, China in particular, though. And that demand has led to just huge demand. I mean, there's been huge demand from those markets for Australian raw resources, and that's been a tremendous boon to the economy there. But over the past few years, the global economy has kind of been getting rickety, and so some of those commodity prices have been following. So there's sort of a slow shift, sort of a slowing of the Australian economy now. But I hadn't read that it was getting to a point of collapse. So that's I don't follow Australia's economy that closely, so I don't know, maybe it is. But my impression is more than just that it was slowing down. I wouldn't be surprised if the housing market were significantly falling, because after growing for so many decades, I could see how that might turn into a bubble. So yeah, I could definitely see the housing market kind of imploding, possibly. But as for the economy itself, it's probably just correcting. It's very bizarre to have an economy expand for as long as Australia's did. That's very unusual among economies. So a correction was inevitable sooner or later. And as for whether the 2019 recession, maybe I should explain that too. Nominally, there is predicted to be a recession is kind of predicted for 2019 to start sometime in 2019. But it's based on kind of mixed data, so it's not really a sure thing. There's just some early signs of that. I think one of the signs was that there was an inverted yield curve here in the US anyway, but I think somebody in chat actually mentioned that those were not the what the interest rates normally use to look at it to measure, inverted rates like that were not the ones that actually inverted.
What is an inverted yield curve?
What is an inverted yield curve? So I'll try not to embarrass myself too badly here. Basically, it's the difference between long-term and short-term debt. And I think specifically it's US Treasuries. And the idea is that normally, I want to say, short-term debt is less risky than long-term debt. But then when people start predicting a recession on the horizon, then the short-term debt becomes more risky, so there's less of a difference between the short and long-term debt. And so that's what it means by inverted. Normally, short-term debt is, how should I say this, lower, rather I should say the interest rates on short-term debt are lower than long-term for long-term debt, but then when they invert, the short-term debt has higher interest rates, hence the name inverted yield curve. And generally, that's a pretty strong predictor of a recession on the horizon, which is why people were kind of concerned when they started seeing that. But like I was saying, somebody in chat had mentioned that the specific debt instruments for which the interest rates had inverted like that were not the ones that normally predict recessions. So I think it's 10-year treasuries. I hope I'm remembering that right. Normally it's 10-year treasuries that predict the recessions. So when you see an inverted yield curve for them, that's when there's alarm bells. And so by all means, somebody please do correct me if I'm getting that wrong. That's very much off the top of my head. But I think what the yields that have inverted thus far have been 5-year yield, 5-year bonds, 5-year US treasuries. And apparently those aren't as useful as predictors. So let's see. I heard that upwards of 50% ocean life has died and almost all coral reefs are experiencing bleaching. Any insights into the state of the environment globally or locally? Yeah, the environment isn't really my specialty. Environmental economics, that sort of thing. I don't have a background in that. So all I really know is just kind of what I've been reading in the news, and that's the same as what everybody else has been reading. So I can't really add special insight to that. In general, there's lots of stories about like this, like bleaching of reefs, the acidification of oceans, soil erosion being a particular issue.
You've also got just like general pollution of bodies of water, which affects marine life and stuff. There have been quite a few different reports. I have a few subreddits that I'm subscribed to that keep track of environment kind of stuff like that. But it seems like the main big trends that we see are the diversity of species is going down. A lot of species are going extinct. And then calling climate change global warming has kind of worked against us because we have like super cold phenomena. Like a lot of people in the Midwest and northern United States and Canada had extremely cold temperatures, like way in the negative. So if you have certain people who are saying there's global warming, it's a problem, and then a polar vortex rolls in, it's really confusing. So the climate change that it seems like is happening is mostly decreasing the stability of temperatures rather than just moving them in one direction, which I think was the conventional understanding a couple decades ago.
Yeah. Yeah, I would have to concur. Yeah, that's more than I know on it. I think plastic in the oceans. That was a big thing that I was reading about.
Great Pacific Garbage Patch.
Great Pacific or Garbage Patch.
We've made our own little continent in the sea of garbage.
So that soil erosion, desertification is kind of ongoing. I don't think we have as much of a problem with that in the U.S., but that's more of a problem in places like China. Sort of in the north of China, there's been a lot of that over the past half century. Although the government has responded to that, they have taken steps, so it has slowed. That's not as much of a problem as it used to be. I think there's also desertification in, I want to say, the Sahel. I think that's been a problem there. And obviously deforestation, the Amazon rainforest, among other places.
What is the Sahel?
The Sahel is a region in sub-Saharan Africa. It's the region that borders the Sahara Desert to the south. And it's a big long strip that runs roughly from the Atlantic coast over to, I want to say, Ethiopia, basically. And it's basically a flat plain. It's relatively dry, but obviously it's not nearly as dry as the Sahara Desert. So, I mean, I guess you could kind of roughly compare it to the Great Plain in Central Asia. Sort of that big plain that kind of connects East Asia with Europe. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. Sort of the Central Asian steppe, I guess. It's roughly similar to that in so much as it's very flat, relatively dry, and that it's home to a lot of nomadic peoples, or at least people who have historically been nomadic. It's also similar to the Central Asian steppe in that it's kind of been a highway historically. Lots of nomadic people who have generally been used horses to kind of obviously everybody uses horses to get around, so nomadic people in particular are very much horse cultures. They rely disproportionately on horses, kind of like Central Asian peoples like the Mongols or the Kipchaks or what have you. And so similar to them, there are cultures that live on the Sahel who are just like that. They're horse cultures that are very nomadic. And they've used the Sahel as kind of a highway, because obviously it's easier to travel than, a forest or a jungle or what have you. So there's actually been a lot of civilizations that have risen and fallen along the trade routes that were developed, east-west along the Sahel. I don't know nearly as much about Africa as I should, so, that's all, like, very basic introductory stuff. So, again, if I'm wrong on that, correct me. But, yeah, that's the Sahel in a nutshell.
Nice rhyme.
Oh.
Agent Smith is a rap god. We didn't know until episode 48. He couldn't stop himself.
Well, I would also add that there is at least one major river that moves through it, and I think it's the Niger River. So that's sort of where most of the people live. You know, obviously there's nomadic peoples kind of distributed without, but it's also a center for agriculture, and it's that agriculture and the ethnicities and cultural groups and whatnot that are agriculture very much center along the Niger River. And I think there's also another center around Lake Chad, but I could be wrong on that, but I think that's true. Which is kind of, I think it's shrinking. It used to be much bigger than it is now, but I think it's still relatively substantive. So those are sort of two population centers for the Sahel region. But yeah, they've been, I guess the original point was they've been having problems with desertification. The Sahara's kind of been moving south. What else? Fresh water has been a problem. You know, I was reading, I think a week or two ago, about melting glaciers in the Himalayas and how that would be a problem since a lot of the major rivers that, what's the word I want? Have their headwaters in the Himalayas. A lot of rivers, major rivers that have their headwaters in the Himalayas, kind of get a lot of their water from melted glaciers up there. So it's kind of important for those glaciers to build up, and because that's not happening as much, you know, in part because less rain, in part because climate change, they may not get as much water downstream in future. And given how dependent people are on rivers like, you know, the Brahmaputra, you know, the Indus, the Ganga, that could be a big problem for a very large number of people. I don't know, this is just the stuff I'm remembering off the top of my head. And again, I don't know that much about it, but in general, yeah, there are kind of problems environmentally around the world.
Are you saying that you're not a climate scientist?
I think that would be a very accurate assessment.
Okay.
I think that would be very accurate. So I'll kind of leave it at that. Do you have any opinion on the Chinese social credit score system that was implemented a couple months ago? Has there been any impact on the rest of the world?
We got that one in the past. But yeah.
Yeah. We've hit on it a little bit. For those, I think most people are pretty familiar with it at this point, because I think it's been getting reported more lately. But basically, the Chinese government implemented a social credit score that's kind of akin to the credit score system we have here in the U.S. as well as the rest of the world. But instead of just focusing on your ability to pay back debt, it's more focused on your behavior. You know, so if you get arrested for something petty, or you know, you cheat, or you know, just something like that, that can knock down your social credit score. And the result is that they can, what I think the outcome is that the government will restrict you from buying things like train tickets, plane tickets, etc., basically restricting your mobility in country. So we don't really know a lot about how it's been implemented, or even necessarily how it works. So it's kind of hard to comment on and beyond that. You know, the party doesn't really care to share such things. It's kind of opaque. As for the impact on the rest of the world, it's probably too soon to tell. I don't think it'll end up having much impact, because I think the party is mostly concerned with people in China. You know, it's very much meant to focus on Chinese citizens and influencing their behavior. So I don't know that the rest of the world will necessarily be affected that much. I guess hypothetically they could extend it to citizens around the world and just kind of buy data on the open market and kind of rate people like that. But if they are, they haven't tipped their hat yet. And I don't know that the party would really care that much anyway. They've kind of got their hands full with 1 billion plus Chinese. They don't really need more problems than that. Let's see, do you have any comments on Andrew Yang's presidential run? What do you think of Yang's universal basic income policy? I know a little bit more about him. I think somebody asked me this like last year. So I've read a little bit more about him, and I saw an interview of him, I think on Joe Rogan's podcast.
Joe Rogan.
So, yeah. I mean, my impression is that in general he raises some good points, but that probably it's not going to be politically viable. It's just going to require too much of an increase in tax revenue, at least from what I've heard from him. So it's probably not going to happen. And just on that count, I don't think he's likely to win. That's assuming he would get the nomination from the Democratic Party, and I think he is running as a Democrat.
Well, you would have to, with that kind of...
Yeah. But that raises a whole other problem, which is he likely to win the nomination in the first place? And I don't think that's likely either. I think there's other people who are more experienced politicians who are going to have better political machines and better political instincts. He strikes me as somebody who's he strikes me as more of a technocrat. Somebody who's very technically inclined and is good with policy, but who doesn't necessarily have a lot of political acumen. And maybe I'm wrong on that, but that was just kind of my early impression. He kind of just seems to lack some of that panache and political discipline, I guess you could call it. Some people consider that a plus. Some people like candidates who are very open and who kind of feel genuine. But
he doesn't seem corrupt enough,
Well, the problem with being genuine is that once people know who you are, the people who like you will really love you because they think that you're really being honest. But then there's also going to be a cohort of people who just really hate you just because they hate you for who you really are, basically. And that's going to be a problem. That's why politicians generally try to hedge. They generally don't try not to be too open and try to kind of speak in ambiguities just to try to maximize their popularity amongst a broader range of people. Obviously, you can't be popular with everybody, but if you're too open, then you're going to alienate people who might otherwise have supported you. So that's kind of the downside of being very politically open like that, being a little too genuine. And I suspect he might have that problem.
He needs to just find the evil within himself, and then he can be successful in politics.
Well, he doesn't need to find evil. He just needs to probably hire a good PR company or some political consultants.
Is that a way of saying find ruthlessness? Trying to translate for people who don't follow this kind of thing.
Debatably so. I think there was that kind of reminds me of a British TV show back in the day. I think it was called Absolute Power. That was very much sort of their perspective on the PR industry. Very, very interesting show. I definitely recommend it to people who have the time and inclination. As for what I think of Yang's universal basic income policy, we've gotten lots of UBI questions over the past... Has it really been 2 years?
Approaching that. I think it's about... in about 2 months it'll be 2 years, I think.
Wow. Doesn't feel like 2 years, does it?
I just know because I filed the taxes for year 2 of Agent Smith.
Wow. Well, in the past we've kind of talked about it, and in general, I would kind of repeat my answers from then, which is that I still don't know a whole lot about UBI and just all the technical details, so I can't comment on it too deeply. But I do know that its implementation will be important in determining whether or not it's politically viable. And I don't know that Yang's proposal is, sufficiently politically wily to really make it past the obvious political opposition it's going to run into. Let's see. Is there an alternative policy? Are there alternative policies to look at to offset job losses due to automation?
We touched on that a little bit in that automation also creates some jobs, but
yeah,
I think it was actually last week we were talking about we'll probably lose more jobs than we gain. It's a little bit debatable because the new types of jobs don't exist yet, so it's tough to say exactly how many of those there will be.
Yeah, that's exactly the problem. It's difficult to say just how many job losses there will be. So it may not be a problem in the first place. Maybe that there's sufficient innovation to generate new types of jobs that can employ a broad range of people. But the question specifically was offset job losses. There's going to be job losses regardless, so what could be done alternatively to offset job losses? Assuming then that there's not jobs generated by innovation in turn, just from stemming from automation. You could argue UBI, although I guess you're asking alternatives to UBI. So beyond those two possibilities, yeah, there's a whole range of things. I mean, UBI is kind of an extreme example, an extreme end of a spectrum of policy. You don't have to give money to everybody. You could do something like partial basic income, where you identify specific groups or classes of people who you kind of give some basic income to, and you might be able to identify specifically the people who are unemployed or became unemployed because of automation. Although that would be obviously very difficult, probably not entirely feasible, but hypothetically that is something you could do. You could just give those people basic income and basically have everybody else operate in the pre-market. Alternatively, you could just do nothing. That's also viable. A lot of people wouldn't like it, but assuming that society kind of continued to develop and that the economy continued to develop, and maybe that the number of people, by the time automation and job losses from automation hits critical mass, and maybe that there's enough other industries and other sources of employment that the job losses kind of are not politically relevant enough, that they're not large enough to be politically relevant, rather. Let's put it like that. So in that sense, yeah, maybe the policy is no policy. Or you could go really extreme and just bring back slavery.
Well, there are lots of games about that now for like robots, and I think Blade Runner kind of touches on some of those principles too, of like the rights of non-human persons. We talked about that, I think it was a year and a bit ago. It's the expanding sphere of moral concern, and how that's been kind of expanding toward animal rights, but as AI continues to improve, sci-fi is entertaining the sort of robot rights.
Yeah.
That sort of thing.
Yeah, that's an interesting direction things could go to. It may be that we could end up with, what were they called? Luddites. People who were opposed to technological innovation. So it may be that part of the response to job losses is to inhibit further technological innovation, to try to stem the tide and try to preserve as many of those human jobs as possible. Or maybe even create a whole set of policies that prioritize human employment over technological innovation. That's also possible. So, whole range of possibilities there. It's difficult to say which one is likely. Like we've said before, it's probably, the actual policies implemented in response will probably vary significantly from country to country, depending on the domestic politics within each of them. Let's see. Can you tell me more about the travel advisory being upgraded to level 2 in China? It seems they mentioned getting exit bans that sometimes is imposed on a U.S. citizen without their knowledge, and sometimes for years. Is this related to the Chinese social credit system? I haven't heard about that. Travel bans. Travel advisory upgraded to level 2. I don't think it would be related to the social credit system. I suspect it's probably more a function of relations between the U.S. and China. It may be that they're trying to generate a little bit of leverage in the trade negotiations. That wouldn't surprise me. They've done something similar with, what's her name? She's the financial officer for Huawei, who was arrested in Vancouver a month or two ago. So after that happened, the Chinese government responded by detaining a number of Canadian citizens on, various charges. I think, well, there was one at least that was espionage. He was accused of espionage. And there was also a Canadian whose sentence was extended. He was charged on a drug sentence. He was brought up on a drug charge, rather. And they kind of trotted him out and extended his sentence somewhat arbitrarily. At least that was sort of the criticism. So they've been kind of bringing pressure to bear like that on Canada, so it might be that they're trying to do something similar with the U.S. But I haven't heard about exit bans in China yet. So thank you for letting me know. I'll look that up. And maybe I'll have something more on it next week. But for now, yeah, I don't know enough about it to really comment on it too much.
Exit bans seem very un-American. It's like a
They
reverse
sure do.
exile.
Well, sometimes they just don't want you there.
No, but
Oh, wait,
that's what an
that
exit
would be
ban
the
is.
opposite.
Is they
That's
don't
the
want you
opposite.
anywhere else.
Yeah, I'm not even sure how that would really work.
It's like house arrest, but the house is the country.
Mm.
At least there's room to stretch your legs.
Mm. I think there's a similar authority in other countries, but generally it's used for people who are kind of being brought to trial and they're suspected of maybe being a threat to flee. So in cases like that, they'll kind of put some restrictions on them. But I think even in those cases, they're not technically banned from leaving. I think if they made it to the airport or something, they might be able. I'm not sure on that, though. I'm not a lawyer. You can probably tell. But yeah, I'd have to read more about it. I haven't heard too much about it, though, so I'm inclined to think it's not too much of a problem. You know, again, China's political system is very opaque, and it's not really governed by specific, laws and constitutions, constitutional restrictions and whatnot. It's kind of politics in China is very much a function of personal whim. There is party structure. The party does have its apparatus and it does enforce its writ, but there's also a lot of discretion given to lower level officials, and they can often, they can kind of get away with abusing that authority if they want. So in a country like China where that's the case, you kind of take your fate in your own hands when you go. There's no protection like there is in, say, a Western country for people traveling. So if the government just kind of feels like doing something to you, there's not much you can do. There's not like a court of appeal or anything.
Someone's saying Chinese citizens need papers to travel out of China, and it isn't easy if you come from a non-tier 1 city.
Wait, what?
Getting the papers to travel out the country if you're a Chinese citizen.
Yeah, what about a tier 1 city?
It would be easiest to get the papers to leave the country if you were in one of those cities. But if you're from somewhere else, it's a lot more difficult. Yeah. That's a different aspect, too, of the ability of a citizen to perform an action. It's not just whether you're legally allowed, it also involves sort of the hoops you have to jump through to make that happen, and how you could basically make it so elaborate that effectively they can't have a thing that they want. Even though you could say, by the law, you can, it's just so absurdly difficult that it's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's not an uncommon bureaucratic trick, or legal trick, depending on where the rule came from. Yeah, tier 1 cities are kind of prestigious. Generally, they have more politically connected people. People there have more money. So they tend to get preference and things like that within the bureaucracy. They've also got a system of permits by which people that you have to have in order to live in a given place. And they're called, I think it's called the Huawei system. And basically, if you want to move to a place, you have to get the residential permit for that place, the Huawei for that place. And it can be very difficult to get a Huawei to move to some place. And it's especially difficult if you live in a rural area and you want to move to an urban area. Local authorities tend to be very hesitant to just give out Huawei's. Partly that's government policy because they want to prevent large cities from getting even larger. Right now the largest cities in China are pretty huge, and they're trying to direct more urbanization. They want to direct people coming from the countryside to the second and third tier cities in order to kind of lighten the load on the first tier cities. But they still come anyway. They'll still come and work in the informal sector. And so they end up being basically second-class citizens. They don't really have the same rights to education and legal protections that people who do have a Huawei to live in a tier 1 city have. But if you want to move from a tier 1 city someplace, then it's actually relatively easy by comparison. Coming from a tier 1 city means that you're probably educated, have skills, etc., and those are the kind of people that everybody kind of wants. So the paperwork is much easier to get done that way, either for another hukou and probably also for travel documents outside China. But for people living in the rural areas and for maybe lower level cities, it can be tricky. There's just so much unskilled blue collar labor coming out of the countryside that it's creating a big strain on resources. Although they are doing more of it anyway. That's another thing, that's another part of China's development strategy. They're trying to push urbanization as a way to develop the economy. The idea being that cities, living in a city, well, I shouldn't say that. I should say people living in cities have higher incomes. And because the government wants to raise incomes, it thinks that it can raise incomes by just pushing people to live in cities. I think that's a little bit ass backwards, personally. Cities arise organically, just because of the free market. And when they do, they just naturally develop higher wages and whatnot, greater economic activity, higher value economic activity. But if you make it artificial, if you're just artificially inducing people to live in cities, that's not really what's happening. You're kind of doing something different. So I don't know that effort pushing artificial urbanization is a very good idea. They could end up just distorting the market and creating an even worse problem that ends up kind of blowing up later on. So let's see. How do you think New Macedonia joining NATO will affect Europe-Russia relation? I don't think it will. Yeah, I don't think there's much reason for it to. I don't think Russia really considers Macedonia a key interest in the region. They've been active there. They do have. I think they do sell gas to Macedonia, like they do most of the rest of the Balkans. So they do have some influence there. But I don't think they see it as strategically imperative to stop Macedonia from joining NATO. I'm sure they would like to stop Macedonia from joining NATO, but I don't think they think it's all that important. A lot of countries in the Balkans have kind of gotten on the path to join NATO over the past few years. I think Montenegro was the last one. Actually, I think they joined outright, though, didn't they? Yeah, I think maybe they did. But I mean, it's not. I don't think it's just really important for Russia to keep NATO out of the Balkans. I mean, basically, NATO already surrounds the Balkans. So it's kind of not inevitable that they'll end up joining NATO, but even if they don't join NATO, they're not really going to be a great strategic assets for Russia. So yeah, Moscow isn't really pleased with it, but I don't think they really care too much anyway. I don't think it's going to be a deal breaker for them in their relations, either with the region or with the West. So yeah, I don't think it'll be a big problem. They'll definitely complain about it. But I don't think they'll really do much about it, at least not any more than what they've already done. Yeah, there's some people in NATO that aren't entirely happy about it either. One of the criticisms of NATO expansion over the past couple decades is that too many weak countries have been incorporated into the alliance that are basically just dependent on the larger countries to the west, especially the US. So the argument is, why take in those countries when they're more of a liability than an asset? That's kind of a realist argument. Why tie yourself to a weak ally? Why not just focus on strong allies and then kind of leave the smaller countries to bilateral arrangements? There's been some criticism on that count, but those people haven't really carried the day, so to speak. I think Europe kind of wants it more than the US does. That's my suspicion. I think in Europe there's this idea amongst the continent's liberals in particular, and I mean that by classical liberals for the Americans listening. I think Europe's liberals kind of see the expansion not only of NATO but the European Union as being a way to expand to increase the continent's stability and prosperity. I think they see both institutions as kind of two sides of the same coin. And they want to expand them to try to incorporate, especially the Balkans, because that's a region that's kind of struggled over the past few decades. And they think that, if those countries are in NATO and the European Union, then they can have more stability and be less unpredictable. There will be more, if people are more prosperous, then there's not as much reason to fight. And if they're in NATO, if there is a conflict, then NATO can kind of arbitrate it. Whereas before, it was a little more burly, a little more, conflicts could spin out of control. The economy wasn't very good and was kind of struggling, so there wasn't a lot of opportunities. There were some real problems. So it was, I think it's hoped by a lot of European elites that European institutions can kind of improve the situation in the Balkans and make the region less volatile over the long run. Obviously, over the short run, it's probably not going to be as effective.
Metamorphosis complete.
Thank you, Jason, for the host. We're in the middle of world discussion with Agent Smith. Hope you had a good stream. Welcome. The Terran viewers. We're talking about the world. So to give you a brief description of what's going on, I have a real-life friend of mine who is knowledgeable in the ways of history, foreign policy, economics. We're trying to talk about the facts and figure out what's going on. I think Jason has hosted during this time before, but it's interactive, so if you want to ask some questions, you can in the chat. And Ragnarok will pass those along to Mr. Agent Smith. As you were, sir.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Let's see. The next question was something related to automation. Not many people talk about the development of machine learning has led to large advancements in natural language processing. This could stand to threaten a huge aspect of the labor market in less than wealthy parts of the world, such as India. I'm curious how I think these areas will adjust. Would they be forced to license natural language processing software from Google, or would it be sink or swim? Let me think about that. I don't have a background in IT, so this is definitely more of a Kukio question. But let me see what I can conjure up. Because I have read a bit about India's economy, so I'm a little more familiar with that aspect of it. So I'm guessing you're referring to basically programmers in lower income countries like India. I assume this technology, I'm not familiar with the technology, first of all, because I'm not, again, not well technologically inclined. But if that were to disrupt programmers in India, that would certainly be a problem for India's IT sector. But how they would respond to that, I don't know. Be forced to license the software. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to read more about it, because again, I'm not familiar with natural language processing. So I'll open a tab for that. I can read about that and maybe have something next week. I guess I can add, just to give something. IT in India has been one of India's big success stories over the past few decades. And it's led to a lot of development, specifically within Bangalore and the state of Karnataka, but also other places. I think southern India has kind of benefited the most from it, geographically speaking, because a lot of the technical institutes are located there. And those are the areas that are kind of producing most of the IT people, basically programmers and whatnot in India. So anything that could challenge the industry would certainly be very problematic, because India's economy has been kind of struggling to kind of reach the next level. Normally countries that start, well, everybody starts with agriculture, but normally the development process sees a country go from an agricultural economy to a manufacturing economy and then to a services economy. But in India's case, their manufacturing sector never really took off. It has grown a bit since they liberalized their economy in the early 90s, but not really nearly as much as, say, China or certain Asian tiger economies. But what did happen is that their services sector took off. So they kind of skipped a stage, so to speak. Their services sector, that IT sector, really popped around, in the 1990s, I guess it would have been. So since then, India's development has been driven more by the services sector and developments there than it has in the manufacturing sector, which is a little weird, again, because normally it's the other way around. But so that's I bring that up because if something were to happen, then that would seriously affect India's economic development, because they are kind of disproportionately dependent on services sectors like that. So I suspect in the event of some disruptive technological innovation that affected the industry, probably the Indian government would get involved at that point. Unless this is happening far enough in the future that maybe they have a more diversified economy, in which case maybe it's not as much of a problem. But for now, that would be a serious concern for New Delhi. They would definitely want to step in at that point. But I don't know enough about the technology to know exactly what they would be trying to do. Are there any international strategies to bring Russian and the US back towards limiting nuclear weapons proliferation? The Russian nuclear torpedo is terrifying. I think before the Trump administration, the strategy had kind of just been to stay in the treaty, the INF treaty, which I assume is what this person is referencing. The U.S. kind of, under the Obama administration, had accused the Russian government of violating the treaty and developing long-range land-based cruise missiles, basically, nuclear missiles. But it didn't do anything really, because it thought it would be better to stay in the treaty and then try to negotiate Russia's return to the treaty than to pull out of the treaty and have to negotiate a whole new treaty. Which, that's pretty true. Negotiating a whole new treaty is pretty difficult, and regardless of circumstances. So it kind of made a certain amount of sense just to stay in and then just try to pressure Russia in the meantime. But now that the U.S. is out of the treaty, we are going to have to renegotiate a new one if we do want to kind of return to INF-style restrictions. But I don't really know what the U.S. could do in addition to what it's doing now that would really push Russia towards those negotiations again. Russia, for its part, feels like it really needs to develop tactical nuclear weapons to make up for the fact that its population is stagnating, if not falling, and that its military has to defend a huge border that cannot really be practically defended with the conventional forces at the Russian government's disposal. They kind of feel like they have to have tactical nukes to make up the difference. So for them, it's more of a strategic and defense problem. And it's probably not something that they're going to bend on very much. I suspect that's why they started kind of breaking the treaty in the first place. For the U.S., though, the U.S. is already sanctioning Russia, and that's kind of the big tool in terms of foreign policy leverage. So obviously we could scale up sanctions even further. There are other parts of the Russian economy that I don't think have been targeted yet. So that is kind of a sliding scale that could be used. But beyond sanctions, I don't know that there's a whole lot else. The original impetus for the INF treaty was Cold War tension. Specifically, I think it was negotiated in the 80s. And there was a clear desire on the part of both the Soviet government and the US government to move towards denuclearization. Maybe not denuclearization per se, but arms control. And so that created the momentum and the political will necessary to get a treaty done in the first place. But those factors are not really there now. There's not really that same push for arms control. And there's definitely not nearly as much political will for it. So, and I think that's true on both on the part of the Russian government and the US government. So without those two underlying factors, I don't think there's going to be a new agreement anytime soon. I think it's not enough to just say and I don't think it's enough for the US government to just say that they want the Russian government to come back and sign a new INF treaty. I think they're going to have to do something more, and it's going to have to, in order to succeed, it's going to need buy-in from the Russians as well, which means a change in attitude on their part. So, before you can even talk about a return to arms control, there has to be a change in perspective within the Russian and US governments first. And then you can start looking at specific things that can be done to try to push the process forward, little good faith things that can be done to establish goodwill and etc. Trust building steps and whatnot. But I mean, we're not even going to get there until there's just that underlying desire to have that arms control. And I don't really think that's there yet. It could be in the future, but for now, political tensions and perceived interests are not really where they need to be to make that feasible. Let's see. How much do you think tariffs are doing? Net positive for business. Our business is getting severely hurt also. I'm going to assume this person is referring to the U.S. economy and U.S. businesses. It's kind of hard to say. I mean, in general, I don't think the impact has been as great as people thought it was going to be. But it's definitely been having an impact. Steel tariffs have been impacting companies that consume steel to varying degrees. I think there was a guy had an email correspondence before, kind of going back and forth about it. So it definitely kind of varies from industry to industry and firm to firm. Net positive for business. I mean, again, it depends on the business. If you're talking about whether it's net positive for the economy, it's probably a net negative. And that's basically the textbook economics answer. Just in general, you're making inputs more expensive, so just inherently, that's not great for production. That's not great for the economy. It would be better if inputs were cheaper. That's just as a general rule.
I thought it was about symbolism.
Yeah, there's definitely a strong political aspect to the tariffs, but this person is asking specifically about the business side.
Tariffs.
Yeah, so I'm trying to home in on that. Yeah, there's the steel tariffs. Those are probably the most disruptive at this point. There's, obviously the tariffs on China have been disruptive, but I think people can be a little more flexible on that because the tariffs, the China tariffs are specifically targeting China. So if part of your supply chain is China, you can just move it, and there are viable alternatives. But if you're importing steel, you can't really do that because the steel tariffs are being applied to basically everybody. There's a few countries that got exceptions, or rather exemptions, but otherwise that's a global tariff on all steel imported to the U.S. So you can't really just change your source like you might if the steel tariff was just targeting one country. So that's impacting them more. And I think one of the things I was reading earlier is that there was also some substitution in steel goods. Not steel itself, but goods that use steel. There was I think the company that makes there's one company that makes most of the nails that are used in the U.S. Well, that makes most of the U.S. produced nails that are used in the U.S. But because steel became more expensive, prices went up, and so buyers of nails started just importing them. The tariffs are targeting steel specifically, but steel goods made from steel you can still import cheaper because they're still using the cheaper international steel. So some industries are just substituting imported steel-made goods because they do still have access to that cheaper steel and so can ask for cheaper prices. So there's been some of that. I don't really know how much because I haven't looked at the data though. So I'm a little hesitant to say whether or not that's enough to constitute a net negative or not. This is a very wonky question. You would really have to get into the data to really answer it with confidence. And I haven't seen the data specifically. I just know anecdotally from what I've read in the news and from other stories and whatnot that there are definitely industries that have been hurt. But the total effect, which I think is what you're asking for, that's harder to discern. That's a data question. And it might be that it's a very small difference. It might be that there's a very small net gain or benefit, or net gain or detriment one way or the other. It's just a little hard to tell. Because, when you're dealing with what is it now, $19 trillion some economy like with the U.S., things get complicated. It can be hard to track effects. We were talking last week about how primary effects in cost-benefit analysis are a lot easier to discern than secondary effects. And when it comes to studying something like tariffs between the world's two largest economies, even primary effects will be difficult to discern, but secondary effects are really difficult in that case. And you'd have to get into both if you really wanted to try to home in on something like establishing the net benefit or cost of tariffs. Yeah, I think those are the two main tariffs. The steel tariffs, I think there was also aluminum tariffs, and then the China tariffs. There's talk about a possible 25% tariff. I guess I could just kind of touch on that real quick since I had notes on that. If I can find it. Yeah, the Trump administration had initiated a report last year to establish whether or not imports of cars were a national security threat.
Are they throwing the cars at us?
Well, make of it what you will. But that was what the report was supposed to investigate, and nominally, well, not nominally, but I think the reason the Trump administration did that was not because it thought that cars were being lobbed at the United States per se, but rather because they wanted to use that as leverage in trade negotiations, specifically with Europe and Japan, who are, of course, major car exporters. And so I think the Trump administration wants to negotiate a new trade agreement with both. I think that's been established thus far, in which there are lower tariffs on American-made cars coming into Europe and Japan. And so, of course, the Trump administration has a very particular style in trade negotiations, which is to be very abrasive and aggressive. So part of that is going to be this report, which is about to come out. It should be pretty soon, I think. And if car imports are thought to be a national security threat, that could give the president the power to establish a 25% tariff in order to, protect the United States, so to speak. And technically, that is a law on the books that he could use. So that gives him leverage in the negotiations. And so maybe he could get some concessions, maybe not. It just kind of depends on politics in Europe and Japan. But that's something to look forward to. That's going to be coming out soon.
I bet we could catch the throne cars with huge magnets.
You would need very large magnets.
That's what I'm saying, huge magnets.
Yeah, I don't know that that voters would be on board with such a large project. It would be very expensive.
Does the magnet need to be that big? Yes, it does. They're throwing cars at us. This is serious.
I'll tell you what you do, Neuro. Instead of doing that, well, you do that, but what you do is you propose a project for something else that requires a giant magnet. I have no idea what it would be, but just something. You're going to make a faster-than-light spaceship or some amazing new green technology or whatever, and you propose it as a project to, I don't know, stimulate the economy, get some infrastructure spending, what have you. And then you propose a budget of, X amount. So then everybody likes that, they get it passed. So then, as part of the project, the government ends up de facto funding the research and development of your giant magnet. And so then you can get it built. And if there's giant cost overruns in the process, hey, that's great. More money in the economy. It's nobody's fault. It's just, who could have predicted that would happen? Who could predict that building a giant magnet would cost so much?
You can't. It's never been done before.
Exactly.
We're American. We have to take really amazing risks.
And after about 10 years of cost overruns, then it becomes kind of impossible to just scrap the project because sunk cost fallacy, basically. We've already spent so much money on this project, we need to see a return, so let's spend more money on it.
Makes sense to me.
Mind you, this is not an academic theory. This is not an academic example. This is actually what happens in the United States. This is basically textbook what happened with the F-35 program. The technology for which was outlined specifically in the requirements for the plane, as requested by the military, decades ago. They knew that the technology didn't exist from the start. So they knew that putting out the requirement for the technology would require bidders for the contract to develop the technology. And of course, the U.S. government ended up paying for that. Another thing they did with the F-35 is that they did not follow the normal procedure for the F-35. Normally, you develop everything and test it, and then you buy it and enter production. But with the F-35, instead, they did research and development first, but then they decided to do the testing simultaneous with the production. And that created a whole lot of problems. Because then if you find a problem in testing, then you have to go and change what you were already doing in production. So you've got to change the manufacturing process. You have to refit the planes that you've already built. It's a much more expensive process, basically, that way. But then, of course, that's more money for the manufacturer, which may or may not be a good thing, depending on your perspective. There is the argument for maintaining the industrial base. Generally, that's the argument that's used. So that gives them more money. It's more money for research and development. You get the new technologies, and then maybe at some point in the future, you actually get a usable plane. So hypothetically, that's what you could do to get your giant magnet. But I don't think that's what the Trump administration has in mind with the tariff dispute with Europe. I suspect that they're just trying to kind of get some concessions from them. Nominally, they say that they want absolutely no tariffs between Europe and the U.S., a completely free trade agreement of some kind, but I don't think that's ever going to happen. I don't think Europe would ever agree with that. European agricultural interests alone would make it difficult, if not impossible, to say nothing of sundry other interest groups. But the whole reason I brought this up in the first place is to point out that there could be an additional 25% tariff imposed on automobile imports to the U.S., probably from Europe if it's passed, maybe also from Japan. So that could hurt people who are employed in assembly plants for European or Japanese manufacturers, because obviously it's more expensive to import the cars from Germany or Japan, so then they're not going to probably hire as many people. Now the flip side then is that they could there would probably be retaliatory tariffs, so presumably then American manufacturers would kind of return as well. But overall it would be a net drain on the economy. And that would be probably much more damaging than the tariffs that we've seen thus far, I would guess. And that's kind of my presumption. So let's see. Can you explain the Magnitsky Act and its impact on U.S.-Russian policy, if any? So if I'm remembering correctly, the Magnitsky Act was an act passed after somebody in Russia was killed. I think it was a journalist. Or maybe it was an owner of a company and he was imprisoned wrongly. I don't quite remember the exact context. But basically, the U.S. passed the act in response in order to give the U.S. government the power to sanction individuals in response to human rights abuses. Nominally, that's the logic behind it. And that's the gist of it. Again, I'm sketchy on details off the top of my head, but basically that's the gist of it. And the impact on U.S.-Russia relations has been kind of nominal. I mean, it's not the sanctions that are causing the damage in the relationship per se. It's more the ill will that led to the sanctions in the first place. Sanctions are a symptom, not a disease, in that sense. So the Magnitsky Act definitely kind of hurt relations with Russia a bit because they knew it was basically targeting them, and it ended up being used on them. So that wasn't great, but I think the Magnitsky Act itself was not responsible for that. That was more overarching geopolitical tensions in places like the Ukraine and Syria. So that's more the reason for those tensions, and those are more important to the deterioration in U.S.-Russia relation. The act was just a tool by which those tensions kind of played out or were used. So that's all we had for questions. Are we doing okay on time?
Yep. I booked a 70-hour week, so I'm not as energetic as I sometimes would be, but it's been worth it. I'm trying to punch into the rank 1 StarCraft stream slot, which is going to take a lot of effort.
Gotcha.
But we're getting there. I think we got second place last week. Hype.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Well done.
And that's when some of the other ones were promoted, but ours wasn't. Just working extra hard. I'm liking the game right now, so that's good. And it seems like most of the new viewers really like this segment. I mean, there's the usual confusion of, wait, why is this person talking? Is this a podcast? But most of the time it's like, wow, He's not just trying to jam dogma down my throat and proselytize constantly. This is refreshing. He's just trying to talk about facts.
Well, that's the ideal. That's what we strive for here.
There's
Well,
an
if you're feeling-
oversaturation of proselytizing in news, so you can find that elsewhere. It's not hard.
Yeah, there's no shortage for sure. But if you're feeling tired, let me know, because I've got to get up pretty early tomorrow. So, it wouldn't bother me if we wanted to wrap up early.
Okay, so we started, I think, an hour and 45 minutes ago. What do you think about doing another half hour? Sound good?
That's fine. That's
Okay.
fine.
On with the show.
Let's see.
Someone's asking if this has a set time frame. Nice joke. Does anything with my stream have a set time frame? Well, I mean, technically it does. This is the thing that has the closest to a set time frame, usually Sunday. If you're European, that would be Monday morning. But it's always on YouTube. I know we're kind of inconsistent.
It can happen. It's the internet, though. Let's see. What do you think about Price's Law and government worker competence levels? Not sure I'm familiar with Price's Law. Yeah, I don't remember it off the top of my head, so I'd either have to Google it or get some clarification. Price's Law. Price's Law, 50% of the work is done by the square root of the total number of people participating in work. No, I don't think I've read that. Yeah, I'll read more about it over the next week, and maybe I can get back to you then, but for now I'm not familiar enough to really comment on it intelligibly.
That's one of my favorite things as a streamer when someone asks a question. What is your opinion on this thing? Well, my opinion is, what is that? I don't know what that is.
Yeah, I try to give decent answers, even if I don't necessarily know much about the topic in question, but sometimes I just don't have anything, unfortunately. Well, let's see. Well, that's it for questions for now. I guess I could add here a little bit on the U.S. trade negotiations. One of the things the U.S. is doing is that it has put tariffs on Spanish olives. You can believe that.
Wow.
And that's really hurt Spain's olive industry. And the suspicion is that the U.S. is, well, nominally the reason they did it is because there were accusations in the U.S. that Spanish olive sellers were selling below market price. That's somewhat debatable, but nominally that was the accusation and the reason for the tariffs. But the suspicion in Europe is that the U.S. is actually going to use the issue as a stalking horse, quote unquote, for the EU's common agricultural policy. And if you're not familiar with the common agricultural policy, that's the set of agricultural subsidies and other supports that the European Union bureaucracy implements. It's kind of a, well, as the name implies, it's an agricultural policy set by the European Union in order to try to secure Europe's food supply. That was something kind of set up after World War II. I think it was originally set up in the 50s. Maybe it was later than that. But that was the logic. They were going to secure Europe's food supply and try to ease some of the pressure and uncertainty that came with fluctuating market prices. And they spend a lot of money on it. I think paying for the common agricultural policy in the EU budget still comprises the majority of the budget, or at least a very large proportion. It's one of the big things they do over there. But one of the things the U.S. wants in trade negotiations is to have access to Europe's market, which would mean a lot of cheap American-made food coming in. And obviously that would upset that sort of delicate system of supports and subsidies and whatnot that the common agricultural policy props up. So Europe isn't really all that interested in completely free trade in agricultural goods. Most countries aren't. It tends to be a very sensitive sector of the economy that people don't want to really upset, partly because farmers in rural areas tend to have political power, but also because that is a very strategic, sensitive sector, because it produces the nation's food supply, or at least part of it. So the US could use the Common Agricultural Policy, or maybe olives, and try to get to the cap by way of the olive issue, to try to demand more access for US food producers. And if that access is not given, then the US could threaten to hike tariffs further on agricultural goods from Europe. I doubt that they would go that far. Probably more likely they're just going to try to pressure Europe so that they can get some concessions in other areas. Technically, Europe has promised to try to work towards a tariffless free trade system, free trade agreement with the US. That was part of what led to the nominal ceasefire, so to speak, in trade negotiations between Europe and the US last year, which is why you haven't really heard about US-EU trade tensions much over the past few months. But that could be heating up with that report coming out soon, so that's something else to keep your eye on. Could well be hearing a lot more about that very soon. I'm skeptical the U.S. government will push too hard on it. If I had to make a prediction, I would say the U.S. government will probably make some superficial, well, the U.S. and the European Union will make some superficial agreements vis-a-vis trade, and then they'll just kick the can down the road. And that kind of solves everybody's problem. The Trump administration can say it did something, Europe can say that it didn't give up too many concessions, and everybody looks like they accomplished something, which, as we've discussed before, is politically ideal with the politicians involved in such negotiations. Let's see. Thoughts on the gold/silver standard?
Didn't we have that one last week?
We had something like it. We had something similar, but it wasn't thoughts specifically on. We had a question last week that kind of implicitly assumed the gold standard, but this one's asking specifically about the gold-silver standard. The textbook economist's response to that is that it's not very good for the economy in general. There are certainly individuals in an economy who benefit from it. If your principal concern is securing your savings, a gold standard has some advantages in that regard, because gold tends to preserve value a little better than currencies, which are basically perpetually devaluing because of inflation, ideally low-level inflation, sometimes hyperinflation. So there's a little bit of extra risk there with currency, although gold and silver definitely have risk too. There's been some pretty wild swings in prices over time. But the problem with gold and silver as your standard in an economy is that it tends to be deflationary. Because whenever there's a big economic recession or downturn or what have you, people will hoard the gold and silver, which reduces the supply, and that creates liquidity problems in the overarching economy. And if you're a big business, the last thing you want is to lose access to liquidity during an economic downturn, because liquidity helps you grease the wheels, so to speak. If your revenue goes down, but you can't really reduce your cost fast enough, maybe you can avoid insolvency, or maybe save some business by taking on a loan. And that loan may or may not be available if there's not enough liquidity. And with the gold standard, much more likely there's not going to be the liquidity you needed, because people would rather hang on to their gold in a downturn, because during a downturn, gold tends to go up in value because it's a safe haven commodity. Silver as well. But again, not great for businesses, and so that tends the fact that liquidity is damaged like that would exacerbate rather the economic downturn in question. And it kind of you saw something similar to that play out during the Great Depression. In contrast, if you just use fiat currency, there's always liquidity pretty much, and you can scale up liquidity if you want to stimulate the economy in response to something like a big recession, like what was done with the 2008 financial crisis. Again, certain economic actors in an economy may well have an interest in, may well prefer a gold standard or something like that. But most economic actors, and definitely the largest and most powerful economic actors in an economy, generally prefer fiat currency because it's more available. It has the advantage of liquidity. And policymakers tend to prefer it as well because they can manipulate it and use it countercyclically, to try to ease up on rapid expansion and to try to mitigate downturns. So those are some big advantages that you don't really quite have with the gold standard. I will note that a lot of guys in finance seem to really like it. That's an example of how economics and finance kind of differ as sciences. Because again, my perspective is very much from my economic background.
I think from a basic human perspective, the idea of a gold standard is attractive because it gives you some tangible anchor, something that is material that has value, that makes sense. Like I can see the gold, I can hold the gold, I can use the gold to regulate the temperature in my McLaren, that kind of a thing, versus just numbers in a bank account, but like where is the value? It can be kind of deceptive, is it even there?
Yeah, that's always the argument that's brought up, because with gold there's kind of a fixed supply. You can only mine so much at a given time. So the supply is always somewhat restricted, which means that you're not likely to get a giant glutton supply that destroys its value. Whereas with fiat currency, you don't have to look far to find examples of hyperinflation stemming from seigniorage, the printing of money. So fiat currency has that added risk. And that's attractive to a lot of people who don't particularly trust fiat currency or financial institutions or governments.
I think it's fiat. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. Pronunciation. Fiat.
I trust your judgment on that. I'm terrible at pronunciations.
Can we get a confirmation in the chat? Fiat versus fiat. Number 1 or number 2?
Let's see. So how do you see the U.S. trade wars changing in the near future? Oh, well, let me finish that previous thought. I was saying, economics and finance are different fields of study, and you can actually, you can even get a degree, even a PhD in finance. That's a whole track unto itself, and they do overlap somewhat, but generally they study different things. And so it's not necessarily strange that they would kind of come to different conclusions on certain things. So I do notice that people in finance tend to like it more, but in economics, it's kind of very much frowned upon. I'm sure you could find some economists who like it. There's always a few. But I don't think they're in the majority by any stretch.
It's fiat, by popular vote.
Fiat. There you go. Thank you, Chad.
Fiat currency.
Fiat currency. How do you see the U.S. trade wars changing in the near future? It's hard to say because the Trump administration is so unpredictable. They kind of jump from issue to issue, policy to policy, and policy decisions kind of come and go. So it's hard to kind of see patterns. Or if I had to guess, I would say that they'll probably make some superficial agreement of some kind in which there's minor changes to the existing relationship, and then call it a significant change and then leave it. That's kind of been the pattern thus far. There was changes to the U.S.-South Korea Free Trade Agreement. NAFTA was basically renegotiated. But, in both those cases, the changes were not really that big. They were not really all that substantial, but they were kind of made out to be. So everybody kind of walked away happy. I suspect we're going to see more of that. You'll probably see that in negotiations with the EU and also with Japan. That would certainly be ideal from the business community's perspective, because they don't really want disruptions to the established economic linkages. So, if the changes are pretty minor and superficial, that's a pretty minor cost to pay in exchange for certainty, which is what they don't have right now. Certainty and risk are problems if you're if you own a business or if you're an investor or whatnot, because those risks have tangible impacts on your bottom line, even in the abstract. So getting superficial agreements, even if they don't necessarily change much, they add certainty, because people then gain confidence that the trade issue has been dealt with and that it won't be returned to and that there won't be further disruptions to the relationship. So that kind of certainty would help boost confidence amongst traders, exporters, and importers, and whatnot. So I suspect that's more the direction that trade negotiations will go. But that said, that's pure speculation on my part. Who knows? The Trump administration could decide to go hard on Europe and Japan. On the other hand, they could just kick the can down the road and just try to leave it for later. It's very difficult to judge. I think I was reading something last week that suggested that steel tariffs might be on the way out, but I don't think they had anything hard in terms of proof to back that up. So that could be around for a bit longer. Steel tariffs have been pretty popular in the Midwest, especially amongst manufacturing constituencies. So they may well try to hold on to that for until the 2020 election, and just try to use that to gain some votes. But on the other hand, they could use it to get some concessions from trading partners. There were a couple countries that gave concessions in exchange for the exemptions they got from the steel tariffs, but some countries weren't willing to do that. So you might see more negotiations and further that lead to an eventual slow piece-by-piece withdrawal of the steel tariffs, if not also the aluminum tariffs. How do you see U.S.-China relations changing after President Trump leaves office? Actually, they probably won't change all that much, because a lot of the things that the Trump administration is doing with China and the China relationship are things that a lot of people in the policy world have kind of been pushing to do for a long time now. The issue with concern about national security, specifically things like Huawei and and Chinese investment and strategic technologies. The issue with unfair access to Chinese markets, technology transfers, unfair Chinese competition via subsidized state-owned enterprises, and industrial policy. Those have all been long-standing issues. They're not new. They didn't come up with the Trump administration. And there was a lot of people who were kind of lobbying to try to get the government to take more forceful action on those issues, but nobody had really been willing to do a lot before, under the Obama or the second Bush administration. Partly because the economic relationship was considered to be too important, kind of jeopardized. So in a sense, they were kind of willing to trade away those costs in exchange for the benefit of the status quo economic relationship. Another reason that they didn't really do anything is because a lot of business interests were not interested. There were a lot of business interests that wanted more equitable treatment within China, but a lot of them were making enough money into China that it wasn't really as much of an issue. But over the past few years, pressure on foreign companies has escalated a bit, and the Chinese market has kind of been slowing down a bit. So that's mitigated the Chinese government's leverage. It doesn't really have as much vis-a-vis U.S. companies. So more U.S. companies are kind of more willing to come out and ask the government to take more action. So that's also kind of helped that. So those factors will remain the same after Trump is gone. If he is not reelected in 2020 and there's a Democratic administration, I suspect a lot of those same policies that Trump started will probably continue. That said, they'll probably be managed very differently, I would expect. Different approaches, different strategies, different personnel, etc., different organization, or what have you. But I don't think the underlying gist of the policy will change that much. I suspect the U.S. would still be very skeptical of Chinese investment in key technologies and would probably still continue to tighten investment restrictions on that count. It's still going to push for better market access for U.S. firms, and that could well involve more tariffs, or at least a maintenance of the current tariff regime. Another reason that previous presidents didn't want to implement tariffs, wanted to use tariffs as a kind of bludgeon to try to leverage Chinese concessions. There was a political fear that the economy would be disrupted, so much so that they would lose support. So part of that was political calculation. So, in a sense, a lot of administrations were willing to recognize that something should be done, but weren't willing to, because they didn't think it was really politically viable. So they didn't think the public would support it, or the public wouldn't understand it and would blame them for the economic blowback. But Trump doesn't really care as much about that kind of thing. He just kind of went and did it. And now that he has, he's kind of laid the groundwork for future administrations. So future administrations don't have to worry as much about taking that hit, because basically the hit has already been taken, and the Trump administration has kind of taken responsibility for it, and the political blowback has been pretty minimal. People have kind of been willing to give the Trump administration the benefit of the doubt. So future administrations then can kind of point at that and say, okay, well, he did it, and it didn't cause too much of a problem, so it's not as risky as we thought, so let's keep doing it. So in a sense, that's actually something that's very useful that the Trump administration has done. He's kind of opened up the policy options available, or at least that are perceived as being available, vis-a-vis the relationship with China. So that's something that he could actually be remembered very fondly for in future, or at least be respected for, among other things. So yeah, I don't think the relationship with China would necessarily change. I think that's probably, you know, again, the tone and tenor may change, but overall, I think that's moving in a very particular secular direction, regardless of administration. Let's see. Some people talk about how 2008 injected liquidity for banks. Others bring up money velocity. How do liquidity and velocity relate to each other? I think more velocity facilitates liquidity. And for those who don't know what the velocity of money is, so let's say that you have like a fixed supply of dollars, actual physical dollars that you have in the economy. You know, let's say like $1 million. So you print $1 million and you let them out into the economy, and people use them. Now, what happens is those dollars are not used only once. Like if somebody buys a snack somewhere, they might pay $20. So then the nation's GDP then will technically increase by what, $20? Because you know, $20. Well, I guess I should say that the $20 was spent to produce the good in the first place. Technically, that would be more accurate. But regardless, when it's produced and paid for, that's $20 added to the GDP. But that $20 does not then just disappear. It's still there, and it gets recirculated. So velocity refers to the number of times currency is used repeatedly within a given time frame. So that's why calculations of money supply, I think, include velocity. Or at least there's some. I think there's like 4 different calculations of money supply. But the idea is that even if you have a relatively small base of actual supply of dollars in your economy or other currency, you could still end up with, it could still end up being enough because the money gets circulated and used over and over again. So nobody stuffs it under their pillow and just saves it and removes it from circulation. They'll pay for something with it, and then that person will pay for something with that same money, and then so on and so forth, over and over again. So in general, the more velocity there is, the more economic activity is happening. That's recycling the same currency over and over again. So in that sense, if your economy has more velocity, that kind of implies that there's more economic activity, and that probably means that there's more dollars in the system, so to speak, you know, effectively. So liquidity then, you know, is a little bit different. Liquidity refers to the availability of dollars. You know, how available is currency if you need it? And when I say currency, I don't mean like physically bills. I mean like debt. Like if you want to borrow money for something, how easy it is for you to get that money, either by debt or investment or, you know, whatever financial instrument that you use. The ease with which that is possible is what liquidity describes. So, you know, the US stock market is extremely liquid, for example. Like if you go to the stock market and you want to sell a stock, you can definitely do that. You know, you can put your stock up for sale, somebody will definitely buy it, and then you'll have your money. You know, you can have extremely high confidence that you will be able to do that. The same cannot be said for other stock markets. There are other financial centers, other places where if you put certain assets up for sale, you're not guaranteed to get a buyer. Certainly not right away. And in cases like that, generally that's because there's just a lack of liquidity. There's not enough buyers in the market who are there to buy that stuff. And so that stuff goes unbought and it just sits there. So in that case, there's a lack of liquidity. So in general, there is some relationship between liquidity and velocity. You know, more economic activity kind of implies, I think, more money in the system, more buyers, more sellers, etc. And so that kind of implies then that there's more money available to be lent or to be used in general just to buy certain assets, certain goods, services, or assets, what have you. It's not really a direct relationship, though. I don't think there's like a function that links them together. That's more just a general abstraction that I'm kind of outlining there. What do you think of China's increased presence in the Pacific? Do you think it's related to changes in U.S. policy? No, I don't. I think China's presence in the Pacific is very much a function of domestic Chinese politics, specifically the Communist Party of China's own policy preferences and choices. You know, China has kind of wanted to have a stronger presence in the Pacific for a long time, but it kind of really hadn't been in a position to do anything until its economy really started to grow. So that area of the South China Sea that's in dispute has been in dispute for a long time. That's not new. You know, that goes back more than 100 years. But it's only over the past couple decades that the Chinese government, and more specifically the Chinese military, have kind of had the resources to really act on their claim to the region. So as resources have improved, so too has China's actions in the region. The South China Sea in particular, if not also foreign policy in the Pacific generally, kind of become more prominent, more active diplomatically in the region as they've had the greater resources and greater economic leverage with the countries in the region to work with. So none of that was really a function of U.S. policy. That all happened pretty much independent of it. Let's see.
10 to 15 minute warning.
Thank you. Any thoughts on North and South Cyprus? Is peace possible between them? Yeah, it's possible. They've come pretty close to an agreement for a couple of times over the past 10, 20 years, but there was always something that kind of came up. For those not familiar with Cyprus, Cyprus is an island nation in the eastern Mediterranean. Most of the population is ethnically Greek, but there's also a large minority of ethnic Turks there. And for a long time, it was a British territory. It was part of the British Empire. They kind of peeled it off of the Ottoman Empire in, I want to say, like the late 1800s or so. Something around there. And I think it gained independence from Britain in the early 60s or so. And after that, there was some ethnic tension between the Turks and the Greeks on the island because a lot of the Greeks were ethnic nationalists. And they wanted Cyprus to become a part of Greece. But a lot of the ethnic Turks on the island were not comfortable with that. We've talked before about some of the historical enmity between Greeks and Turks in the region. So the ethnic Turks opposed that, and they also opposed some other policies that the Greek government at the time passed. There was a lot of stuff that kind of identified Greek as the only national language instead of also identifying Turkish as an official language. So a lot of the Turkish minority kind of felt put upon and ignored on that count. So eventually what happened was there was a big push to get Cyprus to be annexed by Greece, and the response was a Turkish intervention. And when I say Turkish intervention, I mean that the actual Republic of Turkey, which is, you know, a neighboring country, intervened and sent in its army and occupied basically the northeastern half of the island, which roughly corresponded to the part that was mostly ethnic Turkish. And the Turkish government did that nominally to protect, quote unquote, the ethnic minority there, the Turks there. They did not annex northern Cyprus, rather they kind of peeled it off and made it its own state. But nobody ever recognized it except for Turkey, so it's not really a real country, quote unquote, you know, per se. Whether or not a country is real or not kind of depends on, you know, recognition. Whether or not you can get enough recognition from enough other states to kind of have legal status as a real independent country. But in northern Cyprus's case, only Turkey thus far has recognized them. At least I think it's only Turkey thus far. So they've become rather diplomatically isolated as a result. Meanwhile, the southern half of the island, or so, the Greek half, basically, kind of just went about its business. They didn't like it. They didn't like losing the northern half, but there wasn't really much they could do about it either. But they never gave up their claim to the northern half of the island either. And so they've been basically stonewalling northern Cyprus's diplomatic legitimacy ever since in an effort to kind of pressure them to come to a deal and reintegrate with the rest of the island. For example, Cyprus is a part of the European Union, but northern Cyprus is not. But Cyprus can actually keep northern Cyprus from ever getting in or ever receiving recognition by basically vetoing any attempt by northern Cyprus to get into the European Union. Other countries also aren't recognizing northern Cyprus, but that has more to do with Turkey than it does with, Cyprus. A lot of countries, even those nominally allied to Turkey, have thought that the intervention was illegal. And so ever since, they have refused to recognize the legitimacy of the northern Cyprus government. So nominally, the Greek Cypriot government kind of has the high cards because they can kind of control the degree to which northern Cyprus can be reintegrated into the global economy and global political institution. But thus far, northern Cyprus hasn't really been willing to... well, they've been willing to negotiate, but the problem is that there are hang-ups on both sides. The Turks in northern Cyprus, for their part, are concerned about discrimination. Because again, previously the Greek government had tried to impose Greek as the only national language, and I think there was something also about education having to be in Greek and not Turkish. So the Turks in the north are worried about that again. But then the Greeks, for their part, are not really willing to make, infinite concessions. They do want to have a unified whole island again, a unified whole polity. So they're a little reluctant to give autonomous status to the Turkish part of the island, like they kind of want. So the result is an impasse, and there have been times when it looked like an agreement was possible, but then one side or the other backed out. And it's just kind of been a frozen conflict ever since. Yeah, I definitely think peace is possible between them, but yeah, I'm not sure just what the catalyst would be for it. Obviously, having come close, they could come close again, but I don't know what it would take to really push them over the edge, so to speak. Maybe a lot of diplomatic and economic pressure could do it, but, even then, it's unclear. It's a matter of political will at that point. And there is pretty strong feelings on both sides, both the Turkish and the Greek sides. Yeah, it probably just has to get dragged out until future generations stop giving a shit. And then maybe at that point you can kind of reach a deal, because at that point it won't really matter as much. Alternatively, you could have some weird, bizarre arrangement like Bosnia. Bosnia kind of has two different governments. It has one national government, but the national government is very weak. In reality, it's basically two separate governments that govern Bosnia, with the national government as being kind of a superficial, nominal government. So you might see something like that in Cyprus too. That could be possible, or maybe something like that. It might also depend a lot on Turkey. The big reason that northern Cyprus can continue to kind of exist, basically, economically and politically, is because of Turkish support. So if Turkey were to withdraw that support, or were to threaten to withdraw that support as a form of leverage, that would probably also go a long way towards encouraging a settlement. In turn, the European Union, or maybe some other supporter of the Greek Cypriot government, they could apply pressure too and maybe push them on their end towards a settlement. That might help as well. How will Brexit directly affect us here in the US, and will this change without a British and EU deal? I don't think Brexit will affect us here in the US very much at all, I suspect. We have trade ties with the UK and the European Union, but I don't think the disruption from Brexit will be so great as to really impact US exports that much. Now, I think the bigger disruption is diplomatic, because Britain had kind of been the big US ally in Europe. And since they'll be out of the European Union, they won't be as useful in that role. So that'll be a problem for the US to a degree. It's probably pretty manageable, though. I don't think it'll be a big problem, but nominally, that would be, I think, the biggest impact off the top of my head. There could be more of an effect if there is a US-UK trade agreement agreed, because that is one of the things the UK government has talked about. They're losing some access to the European market, but they could make up for it by signing free trade agreements with other places, and one of those places could be the US. But trade negotiations take a long time. They tend to get drawn out, and I don't know how willing the UK electorate will be to give the kind of concessions that the Trump administration will probably ask for. So that could be a whole political thing, a whole political issue in the UK going forward that could drag out the process or even scupper it completely, depending on the nature of the deal in question. On the plus side, if there were a free trade agreement signed between the US and UK, the effect on the US could be more access to the UK's market, and so then greater exports to the UK. So that's a potential upshot, but it's not really clear whether or not that's going to happen or not. That's more of an unknown possible benefit. Let's see, where do you see the US relationship with India and Brazil going? With Brazil, it seems to be on an upward trajectory, if only because Bolsonaro became president, and he's sent some signals that he wants a closer relationship with the U.S. and to cooperate more closely on international affairs, specifically Venezuela, probably. So probably that relationship will tighten, but I don't know how close it can really get. We've talked a little bit about it before, but basically, Brazil and the Brazilian government may want some concessions in exchange for their support. It may be that they want to improve relations with the U.S., but they kind of want something in return. And it may be that the Trump administration is not willing to do that. For example, I don't know that they would really want to relax steel tariffs. I don't know that the Trump administration would really want to relax steel tariffs as a condition, or as a reward, rather, for greater Brazilian support. So it may be that the Brazilian government becomes disenchanted over time, and Brazil and the U.S. kind of go back to their traditional relationship, which is nominally friendly but somewhat distant. Brazil kind of does its own thing in South America. As for India, the shoe's kind of on the other foot there, because in the case of India, the U.S. is really trying to court India as an ally. And India just really isn't all that interested. There's a lot of political actors and residual Cold War paranoia that kind of makes a lot of people in Indian institutions suspicious of American motives. So it's difficult to build the relationship for that reason. There's definitely been improvement over time, but it's not nearly as close as the United States government kind of would like it to be. But I also don't think that the U.S. government can really offer... I don't think the U.S. government is willing to offer the kinds of concessions that the Indian government is asking for to really take the relationship to the next level. One of the big things they asked for was technology transfers. And the U.S. government has not really been willing to kind of give full technology transfers as far as military equipment. And the Indian government rejects that. That's basically a red line for them. They want access to the technology so that they can not be dependent on a foreign power for their military equipment. If they do have something happen to their military equipment during a conflict or something, they don't want to have to go hat in hand and beg for support to help fix that equipment from that other power. They want to be self-sufficient, such that they're not dependent on somebody else's approval to do this, that, or the other. So they ended up, I think in that specific case, there was a specific case of an airplane contract. I think it was a fighter plane contract, and they ended up going with the French Rafale because the French were willing to make the kind of technology transfers the Indian government was trying to make, or was requesting, rather. On the U.S. end, the U.S. is also asking for greater investment access to India, because the U.S. government wants greater access to India's markets for U.S. firms. That's even less likely than the technology transfers, because the Indian politics is very sensitive to foreign competition in their markets. India did liberalize its economy in the early 90s, but it was not a full liberalization. There's still a lot of things that are very bureaucratic, very state-centric, etc. So that's a big sticking point in the relationship, and it's not really clear how much more the U.S. is going to be able to get there. There are definitely people in India who would like to open up the economy to more investment, but there's also significant political opposition, especially from people like small merchants small business owners, small retailers in particular, people who are afraid that if investment is opened up, then they'll just get swamped, by foreign competition, and that they'll just end up unemployed, basically, that they'll just lose all of their market share. And that's a very significant political demographic in India. That's not small potatoes. And that's in addition to the traditional issues of agricultural access. Agriculture is always a big sticking point in trade negotiations. Agriculture in India is not well developed, but that in turn makes them very paranoid about competition with imported food goods, because they know that prices would definitely fall if they were allowed to kind of just compete freely with domestic producers. So that's a big red line for the Indian government as well. That's something that the U.S. government would definitely try to push for. So those are all very difficult issues. Maybe in the future they can kind of work them out. Maybe the overarching strategic and economic status quo in the world kind of shifts such that a reconciliation and tightening of ties is more feasible. But for now, it's kind of stuck. It's moving forward, but very slowly. There's nominal alignment on certain international issues, but the impression I get is that India is more interested in cooperation with the U.S. than anything resembling an outright alliance. How do you feel about the term precariat? I don't think I've ever heard that term. I'd have to read more about it. Sociology isn't quite my bag. And I don't remember reading about this when I was studying economics. But thank you for kind of asking, because now I can kind of look into it. But yeah, I hate to skip questions or to leave them unanswered. Sometimes I just don't have anything. I try, but that's it for questions, and that's probably more than 15 minutes. I would guess. So I imagine that's about it for time. Oh, he's away from his desk, isn't he? Oh, that's fine. A little extra time then. Well, something else I can bring up here with the last couple minutes. One of the tensions in the relationship between the U.S. and the U.K. is Huawei, because the U.K. has been much less skeptical. The U.K. has been much less skeptical of Huawei than the U.S. has been, and the U.K. has been much more willing to invite Huawei investment into the U.K. economy. And that's been kind of a problem for the U.S. because, of course, the U.S. government is very concerned about the security of Huawei technology. And they're insisting not only that the U.S. they're not only blocking Huawei from the U.S., but they're kind of pushing U.S. allies to also limit the presence of Huawei in their technology infrastructure. And so because the UK is kind of moving in the opposite direction, that's creating a bit of tension there. And there was, I think, there was a statement from the UK, I think a week or two ago, where they were saying that they kind of had the means to ensure the safety of Huawei tech, and so that it wasn't as much of a problem. So on the one hand, if that's true, that could kind of make the issue go away. If the U.S. kind of can be convinced that's the case, that relieves that tension. But as far as I know, the U.S. is still pretty skeptical. So the U.K. as a result is in kind of a catch-22. On the one hand, Huawei's technology is cheaper. It would take a while to try to kind of invest in a Western alternative. And also the UK economy kind of needs the investment. The UK really went out of its way after the 2008 financial crisis, over the past 10 years to try to attract investment from China, maybe a little too much so in some cases, debatably. So there would definitely be a cost there to rejecting Huawei. But on the other hand, embracing Huawei comes at the cost of relations with the US. So, there's a lot of intelligence cooperation between the UK and US. That could be curtailed if the US is sufficiently paranoid about the UK's usage of Huawei. And the US could also cut out the UK from some cooperation in developing new technologies, again, if paranoia about Huawei were sufficiently high. And again, another concern is the trade deal that I mentioned. The UK is going to try to negotiate a trade deal with the US, most likely anyway. After it leaves the EU, it may be that one of the US's conditions for a free trade deal is that the UK marginalize Huawei in a way that kind of meets the US demands on that count. So there's going to be costs there if the UK does kind of embrace Huawei, assuming, of course, that it's not true that they can really kind of control for that security issue. And then there are broader consequences as well. If the UK accepts Huawei, then there may be other allies who kind of follow suit, because the UK is not the only country in Europe that needs foreign investment to try to boost their economy. There's plenty of other countries that are having problems with economic growth and employment. So, once the UK kind of sets the precedent, there's the possibility that other dominoes will fall, so to speak. And so that's another reason that the US is kind of concerned about it. So that's something to keep an eye on. Just keep an eye on how the UK is treating Huawei, and then how the US is kind of responding to it. That'll definitely inform the future relationship there, not only between the US and the UK, but also between the US and Huawei, and by extension, the Chinese government. If the US did kind of soften its line a bit on Huawei, that would imply probably that the US was willing to take a more conciliatory stand vis-a-vis its trade negotiations with China. And we've already kind of seen something like that. I think Trump did release a statement earlier saying that the US should be more open to Huawei, and that US competitors needed to step up their game. And so that kind of sent a signal that that would be something that the US government might be willing to give a concession on. I inferred that that was part of the trade negotiations, that was a signal to the Chinese government that, if they did kind of give some concessions, that there would be US government concessions on Huawei in return. So that could then be a direction that things go in. But again, you can kind of use the relationship between the US and the UK on the Huawei issue as a kind of signaler of that. So that was it.
Nice. Well, this was episode 48 of Agent Smith. I know you read the chat after. There were mostly really heartwarming kind of messages of, wow, I didn't know there was content like this. I like the stream even more. So thanks for coming on again, Agent Smith.
Oh, thanks for having me.
And Ragnarokette did a good job with the questions. We even have fancy check marks and stuff now. It's spiced up.
Thank you very much, Ragnarokette. Much appreciated.
Awesome. So a couple days, should be on YouTube. We've been in a pretty good groove. This is 4 weeks in a row, I think.
Nice.
With Agent Smith. So perhaps next Sunday, perhaps evening-ish time. It's roughly in this time frame. And if you miss it, then, well, it's on YouTube. And it's also in the VOD, usually at the end of a Sunday stream if you can't wait. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on. Until the next one, Mr. Agent Smith.
Yep. See you next time.
Oh, you just got a $15. Nice. I think he may have left the voice chat. Thank you for that, Starion. Big ups, big ups. Sweet action. What a stream today. So we had a